The morning sky over Kimpo Air Base was the color of steel, cold and unforgiving, matching the metal beneath Captain James Jabara's gloved hands. He sat in the cockpit of his F-86 Sabre, the newest and deadliest fighter the United States Air Force had to offer, and tried to ignore the knot of unease that had been growing in his gut for the past 3 weeks. March 1951. The war in Korea had been grinding on for 9 months now, churning through lives and resources with the mindless efficiency of an industrial machine. And in that time, Jabara had learned to trust his instincts above all else. Those instincts had kept him alive through World War II, had guided him through countless dogfights against Luftwaffe pilots who were every bit as skilled and desperate as he was. Right now, those same instincts were screaming that something was fundamentally, dangerously wrong. Not with the mission briefing they had received an hour ago in the operations shack. Not with the weather, which was clear and cold and perfect for combat. With the aircraft itself, with this beautiful, deadly, technologically advanced machine that was supposed to give American pilots the edge they needed to dominate the skies over Korea. Around him, the flight line bustled with the organized chaos of pre-dawn activity that had become as familiar to him as his own heartbeat. Crew chiefs swarmed over the Sabres like devoted priests tending to silver gods, their hands moving with practiced efficiency as they checked oil levels, tested control surfaces with careful deliberation, loaded belts of 50 caliber ammunition into the 6 machine guns that gave these aircraft their teeth and their purpose. The smell of jet fuel hung heavy in the air, thick and cloying, mixed with the acrid tang of hydraulic fluid that stained the concrete in rainbow patterns, and the sharp, metallic scent of gunpowder residue from yesterday's missions, from bullets fired in anger at men who were trying to kill you and whom you were trying to kill in return. Familiar smells, comforting in their own strange way, the routine and ritual of war, the patterns that made sense when nothing else did. Jabara was 27 years old. Though he felt decades older, he had flown P-51 Mustangs against the Luftwaffe in the final months of World War II, had tasted combat when he was barely old enough to vote, had learned the hard lessons that separated the living from the dead in the unforgiving mathematics of aerial warfare. Now he was back, flying an aircraft that represented the absolute cutting edge of aviation technology, a swept-wing jet that could break the speed of sound in a dive and climb to altitudes where the sky turned purple and the curvature of the earth became visible. Beautiful machine, deadly machine. But lately, something had been nagging at him, a pattern he could not quite articulate but could feel in his bones. 3 pilots lost in the past 2 weeks. The number haunted Jabara, played on repeat in his mind during the small hours of the morning when sleep would not come, and he lay in his bunk listening to the sound of other men breathing, other men dreaming, other men who might be dead tomorrow. Good pilots, all 3 of them. Experienced men who had survived the crucible of World War II, who had learned their craft against the best fighter pilots the German Luftwaffe could produce, who should have had the skills and judgment to survive their encounters over Korea. Captain Robert Wayne, who had a wife and 2 daughters waiting for him in California, who carried their photograph in his flight suit pocket and looked at it before every mission. Lieutenant Michael Chen, whose parents had immigrated from China and who felt the bitter irony of fighting against Chinese pilots in a war he barely understood. First Lieutenant David Morrison, 23 years old, who had flown his first combat mission less than a month ago and had shown the kind of natural talent that suggested a long career ahead of him. All 3 had gone down in circumstances that did not quite make sense when you examined the after-action reports, when you listened to the radio recordings, when you tried to piece together what had happened in those final moments before they disappeared. No enemy fire reported in any of the cases. No mechanical failures apparent in the brief, confused radio transmissions before they went silent. Just aircraft falling out of the sky during high-altitude combat, spiraling down through the clouds in uncontrolled descents, never pulling out, never recovering, just falling until they hit the frozen ground of North Korea and became statistics, became names on casualty lists, became grief delivered by telegram to families who would never fully understand how or why their sons and husbands and fathers had died. The official reports called them combat losses, attributed them to enemy action based on nothing more than the fact that the losses had occurred during combat missions, filed them away in the grim accounting of the war. But Jabara was not convinced, had never been convinced. He had been listening to the radio chatter with the obsessive attention of a man looking for patterns, had heard the confusion and bewilderment in those final transmissions, the voices of pilots who had lost control of their aircraft for reasons they themselves could not understand or articulate in their last moments of life. He ran his pre-flight checks with the methodical precision that had kept him alive through 2 wars. Stick movement, full and free. Rudder pedals, responsive. Throttle, smooth through its range. Instruments, all reading nominal. Everything by the book, everything perfect. And yet that unease remained, persistent as a toothache, impossible to ignore. Something was wrong with the Sabre. He knew it the way a man knows a storm is coming, by the way his old injuries ache, by some instinct deeper than reason. His wingman today was First Lieutenant John Bolt, a Marine pilot on exchange with the Air Force, a quiet professional with ice-blue eyes and a reputation for steady nerves under fire. They had flown together a dozen times now, had developed the kind of wordless understanding that came from trusting another man with your life repeatedly and not being disappointed. Bolt was in the aircraft next to his, running through his own pre-flight, his movements visible through the canopy as he worked through the checklist with mechanical efficiency. The radio crackled in Jabara's headset. Tower, giving them clearance for engine start. He glanced over at Bolt, who gave him a thumbs up, then reached for the starter switch. The Sabre's General Electric J-47 engine wound up with a rising whine that he felt in his chest, a sensation of barely controlled power waiting to be unleashed. The turbine spooled up, gauges coming alive, the aircraft transforming from an inert collection of aluminum and steel into a living, breathing weapon. He loved this moment, always had. The transition from static to dynamic, from potential to kinetic. It was like watching something wake up, like feeling a heartbeat begin beneath your hands. The mission brief had been straightforward. Combat air patrol along the Yalu River, the boundary between North Korea and Chinese Manchuria. The invisible line that American pilots were not supposed to cross, but often did in the heat of combat. MiG Alley, they called it. That stretch of frozen sky where Soviet-built fighters, flown by Soviet pilots, pretending to be Chinese or Korean, challenged American jets for supremacy. It was a strange, limited war, full of unspoken rules and careful fictions. A proxy conflict where the 2 great superpowers tested each other without quite committing to open warfare. Jabara found it frustrating, this business of fighting with one hand tied behind your back, but he understood the necessity. Nobody wanted World War III. Nobody wanted nuclear apocalypse. So they fought their limited war in the sky above Korea and pretended the whole world was not watching. The Sabres rolled down the taxiway in pairs, their wheels rumbling over concrete, pitted by countless landings, their silver fuselages catching the weak morning light. Jabara felt the familiar pre-mission tension building in his shoulders, the sharpening of focus that came when you knew you might be trading shots with an enemy pilot in the next 30 minutes. He flexed his fingers, loosened his neck, breathed deeply. Fear was normal. Fear was healthy. Fear kept you alert. The trick was not to let it control you, not to let it freeze your reactions when every millisecond counted. Tower cleared them for takeoff. Jabara pushed the throttle forward and felt the Sabre surge beneath him, acceleration pressing him back into his seat with familiar insistence. The runway blurred past. Nose wheel light? Rotation? The ground fell away, and Korea spread out beneath him, a landscape of frozen rice paddies and snow-covered mountains, a country torn apart by ideological warfare and great power politics, a place where young men killed each other over lines on maps drawn by old men in distant capitals. The climb to altitude was smooth, the Sabre eating up vertical distance with the easy confidence of an aircraft designed for exactly this kind of work. They leveled off at 32,000 feet, where the air was thin and cold and the horizon stretched impossibly far. Up here, above the weather, above the clouds, the world took on a crystalline clarity that Jabara always found both beautiful and unsettling. So much emptiness, so much space to fall through if something went wrong. Sabre lead, this is Dentist Control. We have bogies bearing 340, angels 2 to 8, range 40 miles. The radar controller's voice was calm, professional, giving them the intercept vector that would bring them into contact with enemy aircraft. MiGs, almost certainly. The Soviets had been aggressive lately, pushing deeper into the combat zone, testing American resolve, probing for weaknesses. Copy, Dentist Control. Sabre flight is engaged. Jabara banked left, Bolt tucking in close on his wing, the two sabers moving as one. His pulse quickened. This was it. The moment when all the training, all the preparation, all the nervous anticipation crystallized into action. He checked his guns, verified his ammunition count. 300 rounds per gun, 1,800 bullets total to throw at the enemy. It seemed like a lot until you realized that at the rate of fire these guns achieved, you could empty them in less than 20 seconds if you held the trigger down. Discipline. Fire in short bursts. Make every shot count. The MiGs appeared as specks against the distant sky, growing larger as the range closed. 4 of them, flying in a loose formation that suggested confidence or perhaps contempt for their American adversaries. Jabara felt his jaw tighten. The MiG-15 was a formidable opponent, faster in a climb than the Sabre, more maneuverable at high altitude, armed with cannons that could tear an aircraft apart with a single good burst. The Sabre's advantages were in the dive and in sustained turns at lower altitudes, and in the training and experience of its pilots. On any given day, in any given engagement, the outcome was uncertain. That was what made it terrifying. That was what made it real. Sabre 2, we'll take the northern pair. Split on my mark. Jabara's voice was steady, despite the adrenaline flooding his system. He had done this enough times that the fear was manageable, channeled into focus rather than paralysis. The MiGs were close now, close enough that he could see their swept wings and the red stars painted on their fuselages. Close enough to kill, close enough to be killed. 3, 2, 1, mark. He broke hard right, Bolt breaking left, the two Sabres separating to engage different targets and prevent the MiGs from ganging up on either of them. The lead MiG reacted instantly, rolling inverted and pulling through, trying to get his nose around to track Jabara. Good pilot, fast reactions. This was going to be interesting. Jabara pulled into a climbing turn, using the Sabre's power to gain altitude advantage. The G-forces built, pressing him down into his seat, making his flight suit feel like it weighed 100 pounds. He tightened his core muscles, forced blood to stay in his brain, fought the grayness that crept in at the edges of his vision. The MiG was turning with him, matching his climb, the two aircraft spiraling upward in a deadly ballet that would end when one pilot made a mistake or ran out of energy or luck. Altitude 34,000 feet, 35,000, 36,000. The air was incredibly thin up here, the controls getting mushy, the wings barely generating enough lift to maintain the turn. Jabara could feel the Sabre starting to protest, could feel the airframe shuddering slightly as it approached its limits. But he needed the altitude, needed the energy, needed to be above the MiG when the inevitable reversal came. The MiG pilot knew what he was doing. He was hanging in there, matching Jabara's climb despite the Sabre's superior power at this altitude. Patient, disciplined, waiting for his moment. Jabara respected that. You could hate the enemy's ideology, hate the system they represented, and still respect the skill of a good pilot. In the air, politics disappeared. In the air, there was only the purity of the contest, man and machine against man and machine. 37,000 feet. The Sabre's climb rate was falling off now, the engine struggling in air so thin that combustion barely worked. Jabara made his decision. He rolled inverted, pulling the nose down toward the earth far below, converting all that precious altitude back into speed. The airspeed indicator spun upward. 400 knots. 500. 600. The Sabre accelerated with savage enthusiasm, diving back toward the MiG, which had continued climbing and was now above him but energy poor. Vulnerable. The MiG pilot saw him coming and tried to roll away, but he was too slow, too committed to his climb. Jabara pulled lead, his gun sight tracking across the sky, anticipating where the MiG would be in the next second. His finger found the trigger. The 650 caliber machine guns erupted with a sound like ripping canvas, the tracers walking across the sky in bright orange streaks. He saw strikes, saw metal tear, saw the MiG shudder under the impacts. But the MiG pilot was not done. Even damaged, he was dangerous. He rolled hard, reversing his turn, trying to get his own guns to bear. Jabara followed, hauling the Sabre around, the G-forces crushing him, his vision tunneling. The two aircraft merged, passing within feet of each other, so close that Jabara could see the other pilot's face, could see his eyes wide behind his oxygen mask, could see the desperation and determination of a man fighting for his life. They separated, both aircraft bleeding energy from the violent maneuvers. Jabara looked for Bolt, spotted him a mile away, engaged with his own MiG, a swirling furball of tracers and desperate turns. No time to help. Had to trust that Bolt could handle himself. Had to focus on his own fight. The damaged MiG was limping away, streaming smoke, trying to reach the sanctuary of Chinese airspace. Jabara started to pursue, then hesitated. The unwritten rules, the invisible line. If he followed the MiG across the Yalu, if he shot down a damaged enemy over Chinese territory, it could spark an international incident, could escalate this limited war into something far worse. He let the MiG go, watched it disappear into the distance, trailing smoke like a wounded bird. Maybe it would make it home. Maybe it would crash. Either way, it was out of the fight. He called it a probable kill and turned his attention to finding Bolt, to making sure his wingman was still alive. The radio crackled. Sabre lead. Sabre 2. I'm engaged. Defensive. Need help. Bolt's voice was strained, the sound of a man under extreme G-forces, fighting hard. Jabara's head snapped around, eyes scanning the sky, looking for the telltale glint of metal, the white contrails that would mark his wingman's position. There, 2 miles south, at 35,000 feet, two aircraft locked in a vicious turning fight, contrails drawing spirals across the sky. Bolt's Sabre and a MiG, turning inside each other, each trying to get position, to gain the precious few degrees of angle that would allow a killing shot. Jabara dove toward them, building speed, intending to come in behind the MiG and force it off Bolt's tail. But as he dove toward the fight, building speed with his throttle pushed to the stops, his eyes locked on Bolt's aircraft and the MiG circling it like a shark, he saw something that made his blood turn to ice water in his veins, made his breath catch in his throat, made time seem to slow down in that strange way it did when you witnessed something terrible unfolding and could do nothing to stop it. Bolt's Sabre was in a hard left turn, pulling maximum G-force, the vapor streaming from his wingtips, in thick white contrails that marked his path through the sky, like chalk on a blackboard. The aircraft was at the edge of its performance envelope, dancing on that knife edge between controlled flight and departure, every control input critical, every degree of angle mattering. And then, suddenly, without any warning, without any preliminary buffeting or shaking or any of the usual signs that an aircraft was approaching a stall, the nose snapped violently upward. The Sabre's nose pitched up as if yanked by an invisible hand. 20 degrees, 30 degrees, 40 degrees. The angle of attack increasing impossibly fast. The aircraft departed controlled flight in an instant, one wing dropping sharply while the other rose, the whole machine beginning to tumble through the thin air like a leaf caught in a windstorm. Like a wounded bird shot out of the sky, like every pilot's nightmare made manifest, Bolt had lost it. At 35,000 feet, in the middle of combat, with a MiG on his tail waiting to exploit any mistake, With the frozen mountains of North Korea waiting below to claim another victim, he had lost complete control of his aircraft. The Sabre was no longer flying. It was falling with attitude, spinning, tumbling, plummeting toward the earth in a death spiral that had claimed 3 other pilots in the past 2 weeks. Jabara watched in horror as Bolt's Sabre tumbled, spinning now, falling out of the sky like a leaf in autumn wind. The MiG broke off, unwilling to follow into the death spiral, pulling up and away. Smart. No point in pursuing an aircraft that was already doomed. Jabara ignored the departing MiG, focused entirely on Bolt, willing his wingman to recover, to regain control, to pull out before it was too late. Sabre 2, you're in a spin. Release back pressure. Neutralize controls. Jabara's voice was urgent but controlled. Panic helped no one. Bolt needed clear instructions, needed a calm voice to cut through the chaos and confusion of an aircraft trying to kill him. No response. Just the sound of labored breathing on the radio, the grunting of a man fighting G-forces, fighting disorientation, fighting for his life. The Sabre continued to spin, losing altitude rapidly. 30,000 feet, 28,000, 25,000. If Bolt did not recover soon, he would have to eject, would have to abandon his aircraft and take his chances with a parachute over North Korea, which meant capture or death if he survived the landing. And then, somehow, the spin stopped. The Sabre's nose dropped, the wings leveled, and Bolt had control again. Jabara heard him gasping over the radio, heard the raw relief in his breathing. Sabre led, I'm okay. I'm okay. What the hell just happened? That was the question that changed everything. What the hell had just happened? Jabara had been flying fighters since he was 20 years old, had accumulated thousands of hours in high-performance aircraft, had seen every kind of mechanical failure and pilot error imaginable. He had seen Bolt's flying, had flown with him enough times to know the man's capabilities, his strengths and limitations, his decision-making under pressure. The man was good, genuinely skilled, experienced in ways that transcended mere flight hours. Not the type to make basic mistakes, like pulling too hard in a turn, or failing to recognize an approaching stall. And yet the Sabre had simply departed on him, had stalled without warning in the middle of a combat turn, had gone from controlled flight to uncontrolled tumble in the span of perhaps 2 seconds. It was the same pattern Jabara had been seeing, the same inexplicable loss of control that had killed Wayne and Chen and Morrison, the same mysterious failure that command had been attributing to combat stress, or pilot error, or just bad luck. But Jabara knew, with a certainty that was almost physical, that this was not pilot error. This was something else, something systemic, something fundamental. And suddenly, with a clarity that struck him like a lightning bolt, with an understanding that seemed to arrive fully formed rather than building gradually, he saw it. He understood. The connections formed in his mind with almost audible clicks, pieces of a puzzle falling into place to reveal a picture that had been there all along, waiting to be seen. The Sabre had a flaw, a hidden weakness in its design that manifested only under very specific conditions. Conditions that were common in high-altitude combat, but rare enough in normal flight that the problem had not been caught during testing, had not been noticed during routine operations, had only revealed itself when pilots pushed the aircraft to its limits against enemy fighters in the thin air above 30,000 feet. High altitude where the air density was minimal and control surfaces had reduced authority. High G-loads where the aircraft's aerodynamics were at their most complex and unpredictable. Hard turns where angles of attack approached critical values. Put those 3 factors together, and the Sabre would stall without warning, would pitch up suddenly and violently, would depart controlled flight and try to kill its pilot. It was a trap built into the aircraft's very design, a killer lurking in the equations and curves and wind tunnel data, invisible until the right combination of circumstances brought it into the open. Sabre 2, form on me. We're heading home. Jabara's mind was racing, fitting pieces together, understanding dawning like sunrise after a long night. The Sabre had a pitch-up problem. At high angles of attack, at high altitude, the aircraft would suddenly nose up and stall, departing controlled flight without warning. It was a killer, and it had been killing his fellow pilots, and nobody had realized because the deaths all looked like combat losses, like pilot error, like bad luck. They flew back to Kimpo in silence, both men processing what had happened, both understanding that they had just encountered something far more dangerous than enemy aircraft. An enemy you could see, you could fight. A flaw in your own aircraft, hidden and unpredictable, was something else entirely. That was betrayal. That was your own weapon turning against you. Jabara landed the Sabre with unusual care, his mind already jumping ahead to what he needed to do next. He had to report this. Had to make sure command understood that there was a fundamental problem with the F-86. Had to prevent more pilots from dying because of a design flaw that nobody had recognized. As the Sabre rolled to a stop on the flight line, as the engine wound down, and the sudden silence felt oppressive after hours of noise, he sat in the cockpit for a long moment, hands still on the controls, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders like a physical burden. Bolt climbed down from his aircraft looking shaken, his face pale beneath his helmet, his hands trembling slightly with the after effects of adrenaline. He walked over to Jabara's aircraft as Jabara descended the ladder, and for a moment the two men just looked at each other, sharing the understanding of men who had looked into the abyss and pulled back just in time. "That wasn't my fault, was it?" Bolt asked quietly. "I didn't make a mistake up there." "No," Jabara said firmly. "You didn't make a mistake. The aircraft did. And we're going to make damn sure everyone knows it." The debriefing was tense, the atmosphere in the squadron operations room thick with skepticism and barely concealed resistance to what Jabara was saying. He stood at the front of the room, still in his flight suit, his hair matted with sweat from hours in the cockpit, facing a room full of squadron mates and superior officers whose expressions ranged from interested to openly hostile. Some faces showed genuine curiosity, pilots who had perhaps felt something similar themselves and were willing to listen. Others showed skepticism bordering on contempt, men who had built their careers on the F-86 and were not eager to hear that their beloved aircraft might be trying to kill them. The Sabre was the Air Force's golden child, the aircraft that was supposed to give American pilots the decisive edge they needed against Soviet technology and Soviet-trained adversaries, the machine that represented American industrial might and engineering excellence. Suggesting it had a fundamental, potentially fatal flaw was not just unpopular, it was borderline heretical. It was questioning doctrine that had been established by men with far more stars on their shoulders than Jabara would ever wear. It was questioning procurement decisions made by generals and politicians who had staked their reputations on this aircraft. It was questioning the very foundation of their air superiority strategy in Korea and potentially beyond. But Jabara was undeterred, drawing on reserves of stubborn determination that had served him well throughout his career. He had seen too many good men die to care about politics or procurement, or whose feelings might be hurt by uncomfortable truths. He described the pitch-up behavior in precise technical detail, using his hands to demonstrate the sudden nose-up motion, the violent departure from controlled flight. He described the sudden stall that came without any of the usual warning signs, without buffeting or shaking, or any indication that the aircraft was approaching its limits. He pointed out the pattern of losses over the past 2 weeks, describing each incident, naming each dead pilot, forcing the men in the room to remember that these were not just statistics but people they had known, friends and colleagues who had died for reasons nobody had understood until now. He made his case with the dogged, relentless persistence of a man who knew he was absolutely right and who was willing to stake his reputation, his career, everything he had, on making others understand. Lieutenant Colonel Francis Gabreski, the squadron commander and himself an ace from World War II, listened with a furrowed brow. Gabreski was a legend, a man who had shot down 28 German aircraft in the previous war, a pilot whose judgment was trusted implicitly. When Jabara finished speaking, Gabreski was quiet for a long moment, thinking, weighing what he had heard against his own experience, his own observations. "I've felt something similar," Gabreski said finally. "Twice now. I've had the nose want to pitch up on me during hard turns at altitude. I thought I was imagining it, or that I was pushing the aircraft too hard. But if Captain Jabara is right, if Lieutenant Bolt experienced the same thing, then we have a serious problem." He paused, his eyes sweeping the room. "We need to test this. Controlled conditions, high altitude, maximum performance turns. We need to reproduce the phenomenon and understand it. Because if there's a flaw in the Sabre that can kill you without warning, every pilot in this theater needs to know about it." Over the next week, Jabara flew a series of test flights that pushed the F-86 Sabre to its absolute limits, and deliberately beyond, dancing with death in the name of understanding, risking his own life to save the lives of others. Each morning, he would climb into the cockpit with a mixture of determination and dread, knowing that he was about to deliberately induce the very condition that had killed Wayne and Chen and Morrison, that had nearly killed Bolt, that could kill him if he made even a small mistake in judgment or timing. He climbed to altitude, 30,000 feet, 32,000, 35,000, where the air was so thin that you could see the curvature of the earth, and the sky above faded to a deep purple that was almost black. Up there, alone in the vast emptiness with nothing but his own skill and the questionable reliability of his aircraft, he pulled into hard turns, feeling for the edge of the envelope like a blind man feeling for the edge of a cliff, searching for the precise combination of altitude and airspeed and angle of attack and G-load that would trigger the pitch-up. It was dangerous work, perhaps the most dangerous flying he had ever done, and that was saying something for a man who had fought the Luftwaffe over Germany. He was deliberately dancing on the knife edge of controllability, intentionally inducing the very condition that had killed other pilots, pushing the Sabre into the regime where it wanted to depart and tumble and fall. But it was necessary. Understanding the enemy meant you could fight it. Understanding the flaw meant you could compensate for it, could recognize the warning signs, however subtle, could develop the muscle memory and instinctive reactions needed to recover before it was too late, before the spin developed and altitude ran out and the ground rose up to claim another victim. He found the pattern through patient, methodical, terrifying experimentation. Above 30,000 feet, in turns pulling more than 4 Gs, with the aircraft at high angles of attack approaching 15 or 16 degrees, the Sabre's elevator authority would suddenly, catastrophically reverse. Instead of pulling the nose down when you pushed forward on the stick, which was what every pilot expected based on years of training and muscle memory, it would pull the nose up even more sharply, pitching the aircraft into an accelerated stall that could develop into an unrecoverable spin in seconds. It was counterintuitive to the point of being almost malicious, deadly in its unpredictability, and nearly impossible to anticipate if you did not know it was lurking there waiting for you. The first time it happened to him, the first time he felt that sudden wrong reversal of control response, felt the nose pitch up when it should have pitched down, his heart nearly stopped. For one terrible frozen instant he thought he had made a fatal mistake, thought he was going to join Wayne and Chen and Morrison in the statistics. But he fought through the panic, forced himself to think, to remember the physics, to push the stick forward even more aggressively, to unload the wings completely, to break the stall before it developed into something unrecoverable. The Sabre shuddered, wallowed, the stall warning shaking the stick, and then the nose dropped, and he had control again, his hands shaking with adrenaline aftershock, but his mind racing with understanding. Jabara documented everything with the meticulous attention to detail of a man who understood that lives would depend on the clarity and completeness of his work. He spent long hours in the squadron operations shack, hunched over a battered typewriter, translating his visceral understanding gained through terrifying experimentation into precise technical language that other pilots could learn from without having to risk their own lives discovering the same lessons. Altitude ranges where the phenomenon was most likely to occur, correlated with temperature and air density. G-load thresholds that represented points of no return if you were not aware and prepared. Angle of attack limits that marked the boundary between controllable flight and departure. Recovery procedures spelled out in step-by-step detail, describing exactly what inputs to make, how aggressively to push the stick forward, how to recognize when you had broken the stall and could safely resume maneuvering. He created a manual for survival, a guide for pilots who would come after him and face the same hidden killer lurking in their aircraft's design. He included diagrams showing the flight envelope and marking the danger zones in red, visual aids that made the abstract concept of pitch-up into something concrete and understandable. He wrote example scenarios, described what it would feel like when it happened, prepared future pilots for the sudden wrongness of the control reversal, so they would not freeze in confusion the way Morrison had, the way Wayne had, the way Chen had in their final moments. The Air Force took his findings with a seriousness that bordered on alarm, recognizing that they had a potential catastrophe on their hands. They issued emergency bulletins that went out to every F-86 unit, not just in Korea, but worldwide, anywhere American pilots were flying the Sabre. They updated training programs, adding specific modules on pitch-up recognition and recovery. They briefed every Sabre pilot in the theater on the phenomenon in mandatory sessions that Jabara himself often led, standing in front of rooms full of pilots and describing what he had learned, answering their questions, seeing the recognition dawn in eyes of men who had perhaps felt something similar and not known what it meant. They began working urgently with North American Aviation, the company that had designed and built the Sabre, on modifications that would reduce or eliminate the problem. Engineers were pulled from other projects. Wind tunnel tests were run. Prototypes were flown. The company took it seriously too, understanding that their reputation and future contracts depended on solving this problem quickly and completely. Within months, they had developed modifications to the wing leading edge, changes to the horizontal stabilizer design, fixes that would make the pitch-up far less likely and far more recoverable if it did occur. Lives were saved, measurably and documentably. Within a month of the bulletins going out, pilots began reporting successful recoveries from pitch-up incidents that would almost certainly have been fatal before Jabara's investigation. Captain Thomas Harrison recovered from a pitch-up at 33,000 feet, following the procedures exactly as Jabara had written them, pushing the stick forward aggressively despite every instinct screaming at him to pull back, unloading the wing and breaking the stall with less than 10,000 feet of altitude to spare. He landed shaking but alive, and the first thing he did was find Jabara and shake his hand without saying a word, because words were not adequate to express what it meant to be alive when you should have been dead. Lieutenant George Davis recognized the onset conditions during a combat turn, felt the beginnings of the pitch-up and backed off before it fully developed, kept himself in the controllable regime, survived an encounter with a MiG that should have killed him when the aircraft betrayed him. First Lieutenant Joseph McConnell, who would go on to become the top American ace of the Korean War with 16 kills, credited Jabara's work with saving his life during a high-altitude engagement where he felt the pitch-up beginning and knew exactly what to do because he had studied the manual, had internalized the procedures, had prepared himself mentally for exactly this moment. The loss rate dropped precipitously. The mysterious combat losses that had been occurring regularly suddenly stopped, and everyone understood why. Pilots who might have died from unexplained stalls instead recognized the warning signs with the heightened awareness that comes from specific knowledge, recognized the danger in time, and recovered using techniques that Jabara had literally written down for them, had purchased with his own risk and determination and willingness to fly into danger in the name of understanding. Jabara continued flying combat missions throughout the spring of 1951. He engaged MiGs, shot down enemy aircraft, added to his score that would eventually reach 15 confirmed kills, making him the first American jet ace in history. But of all his accomplishments, of all the victories and medals and recognition, he was most proud of the work he had done to identify and solve the the pitch-up problem. Shooting down enemy aircraft was important, was necessary, was what they were there to do. But saving the lives of fellow pilots, preventing deaths from a hidden flaw in their own aircraft, that felt more significant somehow. That felt like it mattered in a way that transcended the immediate tactical concerns of the war. On a warm evening in May, as the Korean winter finally gave way to something resembling spring, Jabara sat outside his quarters drinking coffee and watching the sun set over the airfield. The Sabres were lined up in neat rows, their silver fuselages turning gold in the fading light. Beautiful and deadly, and now fully understood. Tomorrow he would fly again, would climb back into that cockpit and take his chances against Soviet pilots in Soviet aircraft. But tonight, he allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. Bolt walked over, carrying his own cup of coffee, and sat down beside him without asking. They had flown together often since that day, had developed an even deeper bond forged in shared survival and shared purpose. For a while, they just sat in comfortable silence, two men who understood each other without needing words. "I heard from intelligence," Bolt said eventually. "The MiG you damaged that day, the one you let go across the Yalu, it crashed on landing in China. Pilots survived, but the aircraft was totaled." Jabara nodded slowly. He had wondered about that, had thought about the MiG pilot occasionally, hoping in an abstract way that the man had made it home despite the damage. War made you think strange thoughts, made you care about the survival of men you had just been trying to kill. Good for him. Making it home, I mean. "Yeah." Bolt took a sip of his coffee. "You think about them? The enemy pilots?" "Sometimes," Jabara admitted. "They're just doing their job, same as us, fighting for their side, same as we're fighting for ours. Up there in the sky, it's personal and impersonal at the same time. You're trying to kill each other, but there's also this weird respect, like athletes on opposing teams. Except the losers die instead of just going home disappointed." "Yeah, except that." They lapsed into silence again. Somewhere across the field, an engine was being run up for maintenance, the whine of the turbine carrying across the evening air. The sound of war continuing, of preparation for tomorrow's battles, of men and machines preparing to test each other again in the crucible of combat. "You saved a lot of lives," Bolt said quietly. "Figuring out the pitch-up problem. Every pilot in this theater owes you." Jabara shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "I just paid attention, connected some dots. Anyone could have done it. But you did do it. That's what matters." Bolt finished his coffee and stood up. "Anyway, I wanted to say thanks for keeping me from becoming a statistic, for not letting my death get filed away as just another combat loss, for giving a damn." After Bolt left, Jabara sat alone with his thoughts as darkness settled over Korea. He thought about the pilots who had died before he had figured out the pattern, before he had understood what was killing them. Good men, skilled aviators, who had been betrayed by their own aircraft and never knew why. He wished he could have saved them, could have understood sooner, could have prevented their deaths. But dwelling on what-ifs was pointless, was a path to madness. All you could do was learn, adapt, survive, and try to help others do the same. The Sabre had been designed by brilliant engineers, built by skilled workers, tested by brave pilots. It was a magnificent machine, the product of American ingenuity and industrial might. But it was also flawed, as all human creations were flawed, imperfect, despite the best intentions and efforts of those who made it. Recognizing that, accepting that, understanding the limitations as well as the capabilities, that was the mark of wisdom. Perfection did not exist. The best you could hope for was good enough. With eyes wide open to the compromises and dangers, the war would continue for 2 more years, grinding on through stalemate and negotiation, eventually ending in an armistice that settled nothing, resolved nothing, simply froze the conflict in place. Jabara would survive, would return home, would transition to teaching the next generation of fighter pilots. He would carry the lessons of Korea with him, would pass them on to students who would face their own wars, their own enemies, their own challenges. Years later, retired and looking back on his life, on the wars he had fought and the aircraft he had flown, Jabara would remember that day when Bolt's Sabre had pitched up and nearly killed him. Not because it was the most dramatic combat he had seen, not because it was the closest brush with death, but because it was the moment when he had understood something fundamental about the relationship between pilot and machine, about the trust that had to exist but could never be absolute, about the responsibility that came with that understanding. The Sabre had been flawed. The pitch-up had been a killer, lurking in the aircraft's design like a genetic defect, waiting for the right combination of conditions to manifest and claim another victim. But it had been knowable, understandable, solvable, and once understood, once brought into the light and examined and explained, it had lost its power. Pilots who knew about the pitch-up could avoid it, could recognize the onset conditions, could recover if caught by it. Knowledge was the antidote to fear. Understanding was the weapon against the unknown. In the end, that was what Jabara had contributed. Not just kills against enemy aircraft, not just tactical victories in individual engagements, but understanding. He had taken a hidden danger and made it visible, had turned a mysterious killer into a known quantity that could be managed and mitigated. He had saved lives not by shooting down enemies, but by understanding friends, by knowing his own aircraft well enough to see its flaws as clearly as its strengths. The F-86 Sabre would go on to become one of the most successful fighter aircraft in history. The pitch-up problem would be largely solved through modifications to the wing leading edge and changes to the horizontal stabilizer. Later variants of the aircraft would be nearly free of the issue. But the lesson remained, carved into the collective memory of the fighter pilot community. Your aircraft could betray you. The machine you trusted with your life was not infallible. And the only defense against hidden flaws was relentless attention, constant questioning, a willingness to challenge assumptions and demand understanding. On that May evening in 1951, sitting outside his quarters at Kimpo Air Base, watching the sun set over Korea, Jabara did not know all of this yet. He did not know that he would become the first American jet ace, did not know that his name would be remembered and honored, did not know the full scope of what he had accomplished. He knew only that tomorrow he would fly again, that there would be more missions, more combat, more chances to die or survive based on skill and luck, and the thousand small decisions that accumulated into fate. But he also knew that he had made a difference, had changed something important, had taken a problem that was killing his fellow pilots and solved it. And that knowledge, that certainty of having contributed something meaningful, was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything that mattered. The stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky, the same stars that shone over America, over the Soviet Union, over all the places where men fought and died and struggled to make sense of a world that often made no sense at all. Tomorrow the war would continue. Tomorrow he would climb back into his Sabre and fly north to MiG Alley, would dance again with death at 600 miles per hour and 30,000 feet. But tonight, for just this moment, there was peace. There was understanding. There was the quiet satisfaction of having looked at a problem that was killing people and refusing to accept it, refusing to shrug it off as inevitable, refusing to let more pilots die from a flaw that could be understood and overcome. The brutal stall had exposed the fatal weakness hidden in the frontline fighter, but more importantly, it had revealed the strength hidden in the men who flew those fighters, the determination and intelligence and courage that allowed them to confront problems rather than avoid them, to seek understanding rather than accept mystery, to save lives rather than simply count casualties. That strength, that refusal to accept preventable death, that commitment to knowledge and truth, even when it was uncomfortable or unpopular, that was what would win wars. Not just the war in Korea, but the larger struggle for human survival in an age of terrifying weapons and apocalyptic possibilities. Jabara finished his coffee, stood up, and walked back to his quarters. Tomorrow would come soon enough. Tonight, he would sleep the sleep of a man who had done what needed to be done, who had made a difference, who had earned his place in the long, honorable lineage of fighter pilots who understood that courage meant more than just facing the enemy. It meant facing the truth, wherever that truth led, whatever the cost. And that kind of courage, Jabara thought as sleep finally claimed him, was the kind that truly mattered, the kind that truly endured, the kind that would be remembered long after the last shot of the last war had been fired and humanity finally, hopefully, learned to live in peace.